My name is Commander Sarah Lane. 22 years in the United States Navy, 15 of those at sea, 8 commanding nuclear submarines in the most hostile waters on Earth. I have navigated through typhoons that could swallow entire cities, guided my crew through mechanical failures 3 miles beneath the Pacific, and made split-second decisions that kept 150 souls alive when everything around us screamed death. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The ocean doesn't care about your rank. It doesn't respect your medals or your years of service. Underwater, there's only pressure, darkness, and the thin line between coming home and becoming another statistic. Every dive taught me something new about leadership, about responsibility, about what it means to hold other people's lives in your hands when there's nowhere to run and no one coming to save you. I learned to read sonar signatures like sheet music, to feel the subtle vibrations that meant the difference between a school of fish and an enemy vessel. I mastered the art of silence, of moving through the deep without. The submarine service was my world, my identity, my calling. But submarines are a different kind of military life. We don't march in parades. We don't get photographed for recruitment posters. Our victories happen in classified waters. Our heroics are sealed in files that won't be opened for decades. The public doesn't know our names, doesn't see our faces, doesn't understand what we do in the depths where sunlight has never touched. Most people think of the Navy and picture aircraft carriers, fighter jets screaming off flight decks, sailors in dress white standing at attention on gleaming decks. They don't think about the silent service, the crews who disappear beneath the waves for months at a time, who surface only to dive again, deeper and farther from home. My sister Emma never understood this. To her, military service was about visibility, about recognition, about wearing your achievements where everyone could see them. She married a Marine Corps captain, someone whose dress blues came with ribbons and medals that caught the light just right, whose service was celebrated in hometown parades and featured in local newspapers. Emma had always been the golden child. Straight A's, homecoming queen, full scholarship to Georgetown, then law school at Harvard. She moved through life collecting achievements like trophies, each success carefully curated for maximum social impact. Her engagement announcement made the society pages. Her bridal shower was featured in 3 different magazines. Her wedding was planned like a military campaign, every detail orchestrated for perfection. I'd spent the last 18 months deployed in the South China Sea, running reconnaissance missions that I couldn't discuss with anyone outside my security clearance level. While Emma was choosing between ivory and pearl white invitations, I was mapping underwater terrain that hadn't been charted since World War II. While she was tasting wedding cakes, I was 30 hours into a crisis situation that tested every limit of human endurance and submarine technology. The mission had gone flawlessly, but the cost was written into every line on my face, every gray hair that had appeared seemingly overnight. 3 months of cat-and-mouse games with foreign naval forces, pushing our equipment to theoretical limits, making decisions that balanced international diplomacy with crew safety. We'd gathered intelligence that would reshape Pacific Fleet strategy for the next decade, but I couldn't tell anyone that. Not my family, not my friends, not even my own mother. When I finally surfaced and made port in San Diego, I had 72 hours before Emma's wedding. 72 hours to decompress from a deployment that had changed me in ways I was still discovering. To shift from the person who commanded nuclear submarines to the person who was supposed to smile politely at flower arrangements and comment on centerpieces. The contrast was jarring. One day I'm responsible for a vessel worth $2 billion and the lives of the most highly trained technicians in the world. The next day, I'm expected to care about seating charts and whether the bridesmaid shoes match their dresses. The transition felt impossible, like trying to breathe air after months of recycled oxygen. I checked into a hotel near Emma's house in Charleston, South Carolina. The city was beautiful, all antebellum architecture and Spanish moss, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on postcards. Emma had chosen it specifically for its photogenic qualities, its ability to provide the perfect backdrop for her perfect wedding. My dress uniform hung in the hotel closet, pressed and ready. Lieutenant Commander rank insignia, submarine warfare pin, service ribbons that represent deployments and commendations that most people would never understand. It wasn't flashy. Submarine service ribbons tend to be subtle, representing classified achievements and quiet victories. No purple hearts, no bronze stars, just the steady accumulation of professional excellence in a field where mistakes meant death. I'd earned every thread of that uniform through years of the most demanding training the military offered: nuclear engineering, advanced navigation, crisis management, underwater warfare tactics. I'd proven myself in simulator after simulator, test after test, until they trusted me with technology that could level cities and crews whose training represented millions of dollars of investment. But looking at it hanging there, I knew how it would appear to Emma's crowd. Low-key, understated, lacking the visual impact of combat decorations or pilot wings. In a room full of Emma's successful lawyer friends and her fiancé's Marine buddies with their dress blues and combat ribbons, I'd look exactly what Emma had always accused me of being: ordinary. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Emma's fiancé Marcus had served honorably in Afghanistan, earning genuine respect and legitimate decorations, his service was the kind that made sense to civilians. Ground combat, clear objectives, visible enemies, stories that translated well at dinner parties. My service was invisible by design, successful only when no one knew it had happened at all. I stared out the hotel window at Charleston Harbor, watching civilian boats move across water that looked impossibly blue after months of seeing the ocean only through periscope lenses. Tomorrow, I'd put on that uniform and stand in Emma's receiving line, smile for her photographers, pretend that the distance between us was just about geography and time zones rather than fundamental differences in how we understood worth and service and what it meant to matter.
The phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Hope you brought something appropriate to wear. This isn't a military function, you know." I turned off the phone without responding. Outside, the sun was setting over water that looked deceptively peaceful, the kind of calm that only existed on the surface while currents and pressures and hidden dangers moved in the depths below. The Magnolia Plantation venue was everything Emma had dreamed of. Sweeping oak trees draped in Spanish moss created natural archways over manicured lawns that stretched toward the Ashley River. White chairs arranged in perfect rows faced an altar decorated with cascading white roses and baby's breath. The old plantation house served as the backdrop, its columns and wraparound porches creating the kind of southern elegance that photographed beautifully. I arrived 2 hours before the ceremony, as requested by Emma's detailed timeline. The parking area was already filling with luxury cars, BMWs, Mercedes, a few Teslas that belonged to Emma's law firm colleagues. I pulled up in my rental sedan, feeling the contrast immediately. Everything here was about display, about making the right impression. The bridal suite was chaos disguised as organization. Hairstylists worked on bridesmaids, while makeup artists applied final touches. Photographers moved through the room capturing candid moments that were anything but spontaneous. Emma sat in the center of it all, directing traffic like a general commanding troops, except her battlefield was flower arrangements and lighting angles. She looked stunning, I had to admit. The dress was custom designed, something she'd been planning for over a year. Her hair was swept up in an elaborate style that probably took 3 hours to perfect. Every detail was flawless, from her manicured nails to the diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement. "Sarah," Emma's voice cut through the chatter as she spotted me in the doorway. "Finally! I was starting to worry you'd gotten lost at sea again." The bridesmaids giggled at what they assumed was sisterly teasing, but I caught the edge beneath Emma's smile. I was wearing a simple navy dress, appropriate for a civilian wedding, but clearly not up to Emma's standards. She looked me over with the critical eye of someone accustomed to judging appearances, taking in my minimal makeup and practical shoes. "Please tell me you at least brought jewelry," Emma said, her voice carrying just loud enough for the others to hear. "This isn't a military function, you know." One of the bridesmaids, a blonde woman I recognized as Emma's law school roommate, stepped forward with a bright smile. "You must be the sister Emma's always talking about. The one in the Navy, right? That's so interesting. What do you do exactly?" Before I could answer, Emma jumped in. "Sarah drives submarines. Well, not drives, exactly. What do you call it, Sarah? Pilots? Commands?" She waved her hand dismissively. "It's very technical, very specialized." The way she said specialized made it sound like a limitation rather than an achievement. The bridesmaids nodded politely, the kind of response you give when someone mentions a job you don't quite understand and aren't particularly interested in learning about. "How exciting," another bridesmaid offered. "Do you get to travel a lot?" "You could say that," I replied carefully. The truth was that I'd seen the more of the world's oceans than most people would see in 10 lifetimes, but explaining classified deployments to a room full of strangers wasn't exactly an option. Emma sensed the conversation losing momentum and clapped her hands together. "Okay, everyone, we need to start getting ready. Sarah, Marcus wanted to meet you before the ceremony. He's with his groomsmen in the main house. Try not to talk too much shop, okay? This is a wedding, not a military briefing." I found Marcus Fletcher in the plantation's library, a room lined with leather-bound books that probably hadn't been opened in decades. He was adjusting his dress blue uniform in an antique mirror, his reflection showing a man who wore his rank with quiet confidence. Captain's bars gleamed on his shoulders, and his ribbon rack told a story of deployment and valor that needed no explanation. The groomsmen clustered around him were a mix of military and civilian friends, but it was clear that Marcus commanded their respect. When he spoke, they listened. When he moved, they followed. This was a man accustomed to leadership, to being the center of attention in any room he entered. "You must be Sarah," Marcus said, turning from the mirror with a smile that was genuinely warm. "Emma's told me so much about you. Thank you for making the trip. I know deployment schedules don't always cooperate with family events." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off.
His handshake was firm, direct, the kind that military people used to size each other up without saying a word. I could tell he was taking my measure, trying to figure out what kind of officer I was, where I fit in the hierarchy of respect that governed military interactions. "Congratulations," I said. "Emma looks radiant. You're a lucky man." "I definitely am," Marcus agreed. "She's amazing. Brilliant, driven, everything I could ask for in a partner." He gestured toward his groomsmen. "Sarah's a submarine officer," he announced to the group. "Nuclear power, I assume?" "That's right." One of the groomsmen, a young lieutenant who looked like he'd stepped off a recruiting poster, leaned forward with interest. "Fast attack or ballistic missile?" "Fast attack," I replied. "Impressive," the lieutenant said, and I could tell he meant it. Submarine service had a reputation even within the Navy, a recognition that what we did required a special kind of commitment and skill. But Marcus was already moving on, his attention shifting to the wedding timeline and last-minute details. The moment of military connection had passed, replaced by the concerns of a groom on his wedding day. I understood. Today wasn't about service or rank or the invisible battles fought beneath the ocean's surface. Today was about Marcus and Emma, about their future together, about the celebration they'd planned down to the smallest detail. The ceremony space was filling with guests as I made my way outside. I recognized some faces from family gatherings over the years, distant relatives, family friends, people who remembered me as Emma's younger sister rather than Commander Lane. They smiled and waved, offering the kind of polite attention you give to family members you haven't seen in a while, but don't really know. Emma's side of the aisle was packed with impressive people. Partners from her law firm, judges, politicians, the kind of crowd that wielded influence in boardrooms and courtrooms. Their conversations buzzed with references to cases and clients, mergers and acquisitions, the language of power and success. Marcus's side told a different story. Military families, veterans, people who understood sacrifice and service. Their conversations were quieter, more subdued, but carried a weight that came from shared experience and mutual respect. I took my assigned seat in the second row, behind Emma's immediate family. My mother reached over to squeeze my hand, her touch warm and familiar. She looked proud and nervous, the way mothers do at their children's weddings, but I caught her glancing between Emma's side of the church and Marcus's, with an expression I couldn't quite read. The music started, and everyone rose as the processional began. Bridesmaids glided down the aisle in their perfectly coordinated dresses, each step timed to the rhythm of the string quartet. The flower girls scattered petals with the concentration of someone performing brain surgery. The ring bearer marched with military precision that must have been coached by Marcus himself. Then Emma appeared at the back of the aisle, her dress catching the light filtering through the plantation's ancient oaks. She was radiant, confident, every inch the perfect bride. The photographer captured her entrance from multiple angles, making sure every moment was preserved for posterity. As she walked toward Marcus, I saw him in profile waiting at the altar. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, but there was something in his expression that surprised me. Behind the smile, behind the obvious love and pride, I caught a glimpse of something that looked almost like concern. The ceremony was about to begin, and I had no idea that everything I thought I knew about my sister, about Marcus, about my place in this family, was about to change forever. The reception was held in the plantation's grand ballroom, transformed into something that belonged in a magazine spread. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables adorned with towering centerpieces of white hydrangeas and roses. The head table positioned Marcus and Emma like royalty overlooking their kingdom, with wedding party members arranged in order of importance on either side. I found myself seated at table 7, strategically placed between elderly family members and distant cousins. Not the family table, not with Emma's close friends, but in the comfortable middle distance where I could be present without being prominent. The message was clear without being openly hostile. Dinner conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to. Real estate markets, vacation destinations, the social calendar of Charleston's elite. I listened politely, offered appropriate comments when addressed directly, but mostly I observed. This was Emma's world, the life she'd built for herself, and I was clearly a visitor rather than a resident. The speeches began after the main course. Marcus's best man told stories of their deployment together in Afghanistan, painting a picture of leadership under fire and brotherhood forged in combat. Emma's maid of honor recounted law school adventures and career triumphs, highlighting a trajectory of success and recognition. Each speech reinforced the narrative of two accomplished people joining their equally impressive lives.
Then Emma stood to offer her own remarks, something that hadn't been on the original program. She looked radiant in the chandelier light, confident and commanding as she took the microphone. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "Marcus and I are so grateful to be surrounded by the people who matter most to us, family, friends, colleagues who've become family, and the incredible military community that's welcomed me with open arms." Applause rippled through the room as she paused, her gaze sweeping across the tables. When her eyes found mine, they lingered for just a moment too long. "I especially want to acknowledge our service members here tonight," Emma continued. "Marcus has taught me so much about honor, duty, and sacrifice, about what it means to serve something greater than yourself, to earn respect through action, rather than just existing in uniform." The military guests nodded approvingly, clearly moved by her words. But something in her tone made me shift.
uncomfortably in my chair. There was an undercurrent I couldn't quite place, a tension beneath the gracious surface. "I've learned that not all service is created equal," Emma said, her smile never wavering. "Some people charge into battle, leading from the front, making the hard decisions that protect freedom. Others find safer ways to serve, quieter roles that don't require the same level of courage or commitment." The room remained silent, but I felt the shift in energy. Several guests glanced in my direction, confusion flickering across their faces as they tried to understand where this was heading. Emma raised her champagne glass higher. "Tonight, I want to honor real leadership, the kind that puts others first, that faces danger head-on, that earns respect through valor rather than simply existing in uniform." The words hit like a physical blow. The message was unmistakable to anyone who knew my background, delivered with surgical precision disguised as wedding toast sentiment. She was calling me out without naming me, questioning my service while standing in front of 200 people who had no context to understand what was happening. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as conversations stopped at nearby tables. Marcus looked confused, his smile frozen as he tried to process what his new wife was saying. His groomsmen exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the speech. "So here's to my husband," Emma concluded, "who represents the very best of military service, a true leader, a genuine hero, someone who's earned every honor he wears." She turned to Marcus with a brilliant smile. "And here's to recognizing the difference between those who serve with distinction and those who simply serve." The applause was scattered and uncertain. People clapped because they were supposed to, but the energy in the room had shifted. Conversations resumed at a lower volume with an undercurrent of confusion and discomfort. I sat frozen in my chair, the implications of Emma's words settling over me like a weight. She had just publicly dismissed my 22 years of service, reduced my career to simply existing in uniform, and done it on her wedding day in front of our entire family and her new military community. Mrs. Patterson, our elderly great-aunt, reached over and patted my hand. "That was an odd thing to say," she whispered. "What did she mean by that?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't explain without making the situation worse, without turning Emma's wedding into a family drama that would overshadow what should have been her perfect day. So I smiled tightly and shook my head, pretending not to understand the subtext that everyone at our table had picked up on. At the head table, Marcus leaned over to whisper something to Emma. Her response was animated, gestures suggesting she was explaining or defending her remarks. He looked troubled, his gaze briefly finding mine across the room before Emma reclaimed his attention. The dancing began, and I used the distraction to step outside onto the plantation's veranda. The night air was thick with humidity and the scent of jasmine, a stark contrast to the sterile atmosphere of submarine quarters I'd grown accustomed to. I needed space to process what had just happened, to figure out how to handle the rest of the evening. Through the French doors, I could see the reception continuing as if nothing had happened. Emma danced with Marcus, radiant and triumphant. Guests mingled and laughed. The awkwardness of the speech was already fading into background noise. But I knew the damage was done. Emma had achieved her goal. She'd publicly diminished my service while elevating Marcus's, establishing a hierarchy that put me firmly at the bottom. I thought about leaving, making quiet excuses, slipping away before the evening got worse. But that would only confirm what Emma had implied, that I wasn't strong enough to face conflict, that I chose the safe option when things got difficult. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and walked back into the ballroom. If Emma wanted to challenge my service, my courage, my right to wear the uniform I'd earned, then she'd picked the wrong night and the wrong audience. Because somewhere in that room, full of military personnel, was at least one person who would understand exactly what Lieutenant Commander Sarah Lane had accomplished in the silent service. I just had to wait for the right moment to let that truth surface.
As I re-entered the ballroom, my attention was drawn to a figure sitting alone near the back corner, partially hidden by one of the massive floral arrangements. A young man in a navy dress uniform, but something was different about his posture, the way he held himself apart from the celebration swirling around him. He couldn't have been more than 25, with the lean build of someone who'd once been in peak physical condition, but now carried himself carefully, measured movements. His left hand rested on the table, while his right remained hidden beneath the white tablecloth. When he reached for his water glass, I saw that his sleeve of his dress blue jacket was pinned up where his right arm ended just below the elbow.
His name tag read Torres, and his ribbon rack told a story of recent service and sacrifice. Combat Action Ribbon, Purple Heart, Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. This was someone who'd paid a price for his service, and now he sat alone at my sister's wedding while everyone else celebrated. I watched his other guests unconsciously avoided his table, their conversations flowing around him like water around a stone, not from malice, but from the awkward discomfort that many civilians felt around visible reminders of war's cost. He'd been invited, probably through Marcus's military connections, but left to navigate the social complexities of a formal event where his injury made others uncomfortable. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a young sailor whose sacrifice was written across his body for everyone to see, while I'd just been dismissed as someone who simply served in safer roles. Emma's words echoed in my mind as I watched Torres carefully cut his food with one hand, a skill that probably taken months to master. Without overthinking it, I walked over to his table. "Mind if I join you? I'm Sarah Lane, Emma's sister." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Petty Officer First Class Miguel Torres, ma'am. And no, please, sit down." His voice carried a slight accent, warm and genuine despite the formal address. "What brings you to Charleston?" I asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Captain Marcus. He was my company commander in Afghanistan. Saved my life, actually." Torres glanced toward the head table, where Marcus was now deep in conversation with some Marine officers. "He invited me when he heard I was stationed at the Navy Yard here. Didn't expect all this, though." He gestured with his left hand at the elaborate reception. "It's a bit much," I agreed. "Not exactly a casual military gathering." Torres smiled for the first time since I'd set them. "No kidding. I keep waiting for someone to inspect my uniform for proper creases." He paused, studying my face. "Emma's sister. You're military, too, right? I can tell." 22 years in the Navy. Submarine service. His expression changed immediately, respect replacing casual politeness. "Submarines? Damn! Excuse me, ma'am. That's serious business. What boat?" "USS Charlotte most recently. Fast attack." "Holy!" Torres caught himself again, shaking his head in amazement. "Ma'am, with respect, that's badass. I was on surface warfare, destroyer duty before." He gestured toward his missing arm. "But submarine service? That takes a different kind of courage. Being underwater for months, dealing with all that pressure, the technical requirements. How long were you at sea?" The genuine admiration in his voice was a stark contrast to the dismissive tone Emma had used during her speech. Here was a combat veteran who understood exactly what submarine service entailed, who recognized the specialized skills and mental fortitude it required. 18 months in the Pacific. Mostly classified operations, but we covered a lot of ocean, I said. "Wheel," Torres whistled low. 18 months submerged. I thought 4 months on a destroyer was tough." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Can I ask, are you the sister who Captain Fletcher has been asking about all evening?" "What do you mean?" "He's been looking around the room, asking his groomsmen questions about someone named Sarah. Said he needed to find you, that there was something important he had to tell you." Torres glanced toward the head table again. Seemed pretty urgent about it. Before I could process this information fully,
The music shifted to something slower, more intimate. Couples moved onto the dance floor as the evening transitioned into its final phase. I watched Emma dance with her father, both of them smiling for the photographer who circled them like a predator stalking prey. "You know what's funny?" Torres said, following my gaze. "Captain Fletcher never talked much about his personal life downrange. Always professional, always focused on the mission. But the one time he opened up, he mentioned his fiancée's sister who commanded submarines. Said she was one of the toughest officers he'd ever heard about, that her service record was legendary among the submarine community." My heart stopped. He said that? More than once. Used to say he hoped he'd get to meet you someday, that anyone who could handle nuclear submarine command deserved serious respect. Torres frowned. "That's why I was confused by what your sister said during her speech. Didn't sound like she was talking about the same person Captain Fletcher described." The pieces started falling into place. Marcus knew exactly who I was, what I accomplished, what my service meant. He'd been asking about me not out of polite family interest, but because he understood something Emma either didn't know or chose to ignore. My 22 years underwater weren't invisible to everyone, just to the people who should have mattered most. "Petty Officer Torres," I said carefully, "what exactly did Marcus tell you about submarine operations?" "Called them the most dangerous peacetime missions in the Navy. Said submarine commanders had to be part engineer, part diplomat, part warrior. That they operated in complete isolation, making decisions that could start or prevent wars, and nobody back home would ever know about it because it was all classified." Torres met my eyes. Said it took a special kind of person to handle that pressure, literally and figuratively. The irony was overwhelming. My own sister had just spent 10 minutes publicly questioning my courage and commitment, while her new husband had been telling his Marines that my service represented the pinnacle of military leadership. Emma had humiliated me based on ignorance, while Marcus apparently understood exactly what Lieutenant Commander Sarah Lane had accomplished in the silent depths of the world's oceans. "Ma'am," Torres said quietly, "I think Captain Fletcher has been trying to get your attention." I looked up to see Marcus standing at the edge of our table, having approached while Torres and I were talking. His expression was serious, almost formal, and several of his groomsmen had followed him across the room. The casual wedding atmosphere around our table evaporated as people sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Commander Lane?" Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "I believe we need to talk." The way he said my rank, with absolute respect and recognition, made everything else fade into background noise. This wasn't going to be a polite family conversation. This was going to be something else entirely. Marcus stood at attention, his posture shifting into something I recognized immediately, the formal bearing of an officer about to make an official statement. The casual wedding atmosphere around our table evaporated as his groomsmen formed a loose semicircle behind him. Other guests began to notice the unusual formation, conversations dying as attention focused on whatever was about to unfold. "Commander Lane," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing troops. "I owe you an explanation and an apology." The formality of his tone sent ripples through the nearby tables. Guests turned in their chairs, sensing that something significant was happening. Emma, still on the dance floor with her father, hadn't noticed yet. But her law firm colleagues at the adjacent table were leaning in, trying to catch every word. "Sir, that's not necessary," I replied carefully, aware that we now had an audience.
Actually, it is. Marcus's expression was grave. What happened during the speeches tonight was based on incomplete information and misguided assumptions. Information that I should have corrected long before now. Torres shifted beside me, his expression alert and focused. The other military personnel in the room had picked up on the formal tone, recognizing that this wasn't casual conversation anymore. This was something approaching an official proceeding. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. 3 weeks ago, I requested information about your service record through appropriate channels. What I learned should have been shared with my wife before tonight, and I take full responsibility for not doing so. A chill ran down my spine. Marcus, what are you talking about? Commander Sarah Elizabeth Lane, USS Charlotte, Pacific Fleet. 18 months classified operations, South China Sea. Operation Silent Guardian. His voice carried clearly across the room now, and the military guests were hanging on every word. Ring any bells, Commander? My blood ran cold. Operation Silent Guardian was classified at levels that required congressional clearance to discuss. The fact that Marcus even knew the name meant he had access to intelligence briefings far above a typical Marine captain's clearance level. I can't discuss that operation, I said quietly. I know, but I can, because my current assignment involves reviewing Pacific Theater intelligence assessments. Marcus looked around the room, making sure he had everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, you're in the presence of an officer who spent 18 months conducting the most dangerous submarine reconnaissance missions in modern naval history. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, sensing the gravity of whatever was unfolding. Emma finally noticed the unusual gathering and was making her way over, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she took in the formal arrangement of military personnel around our table. During Operation Silent Guardian, Commander Lane navigated her submarine through hostile waters that no American vessel had penetrated in over 20 years. She gathered intelligence that prevented 3 separate international incidents from escalating into armed conflicts. Her crew operated under radio silence for 7 months, making life-or-death decisions without support or backup. Torres stared at me with undisguised awe. 7 months of radio silence? How is that even possible? The mission parameters required complete communication blackout to avoid detection. Commander Lane was essentially operating as an independent commander of a nuclear submarine, responsible for decisions that could have triggered World War III if handled incorrectly. Emma reached our table, her face flushed from dancing and confusion. Marcus, what's going on? Why are you giving military briefings at our wedding? Marcus turned to his new wife, his expression gentle but firm. Emma, I'm correcting a mistake. Several mistakes, actually. What kind of mistakes? The kind where we publicly question the service record of an officer whose classified achievements make my own deployments look like training exercises. Marcus's voice remained respectful but carried an edge of steel. The kind where we suggest that submarine command is somehow easier or safer than ground combat. Emma's face went pale as she began to understand where this was heading. Marcus, You were just wrong. The words were simple, direct, devastating. Commander Lane didn't serve in a safer role. She served in the most dangerous and demanding position the Navy offers. Nuclear submarine command requires more training, more clearances, and more responsibility than any other military occupation. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was watching Emma's face as the implications of Marcus's words sank in. Her perfect wedding speech, her carefully crafted dismissal of my service, was being systematically dismantled by her own husband in front of 200 guests. Furthermore, Marcus continued, during her last deployment, Commander Lane's submarine suffered a reactor coolant leak 400 feet underwater. She kept her crew alive for 36 hours while making emergency repairs that nuclear engineers said were impossible. She saved 150 lives through technical expertise and leadership that most officers couldn't match in 10 careers. Torres let out a low whistle. Reactor emergency underwater. Jesus Christ! The incident was classified because acknowledging it would have revealed operational details about American submarine capabilities.
but the Navy awarded Commander Lane the Meritorious Service Medal and fast-tracked her promotion to captain. That promotion was delayed only because she requested to stay with her crew for their full deployment cycle. Emma was staring at me as if seeing a stranger. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" "Because I couldn't. Because submarine operations are classified, and because our family never seemed particularly interested in understanding what I actually did for a living." The truth hung in the air like smoke. Emma's dismissive comments over the years, her casual references to my technical work, her assumption that my service was somehow less demanding than other military roles, all of it was based on ignorance that I'd been unable to correct due to classification restrictions. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew something else, a small presentation box. "Commander Lane, this arrived at my office yesterday. I was instructed to present it to you during the first appropriate opportunity." He opened the box to reveal a medal I'd never seen before, silver and blue with an anchor and submarine insignia. The Navy Distinguished Service Medal, awarded for exceptional meritorious service in a position of great responsibility. The citation specifically mentions Operation Silent Guardian and your actions during the reactor emergency. The room erupted in applause, led by Torres and the other military guests who understood the significance of what they just witnessed. This wasn't just recognition of past service. This was acknowledgement of achievements that most people would never know existed. Emma stood frozen beside the table, her perfect wedding moment transformed into something she'd never planned for. Her sister, the one she'd publicly dismissed as serving in safer roles, was being honored for service that exceeded anything she had imagined possible. But Marcus wasn't finished. He straightened to full attention, and in a voice that carried across the entire ballroom, spoke 7 words that would change everything. "Commander Lane, it's an honor serving with you." Then, in front of 200 wedding guests, including his new wife, Marcus Fletcher rendered a perfect military salute to his sister-in-law. The salute held for what felt like an eternity. Marcus's arm remained rigid, perfect, while the entire ballroom watched in stunned silence. Then, one by one, every military member present rose to their feet and followed suit. Torres struggled to stand with his one arm, rendering the best salute he could manage. The Marine groomsmen snapped to attention. Even guests who'd never served seemed to understand they were witnessing something profound. I returned the salute, my own arm steady, despite the emotional earthquake happening inside me. When Marcus finally dropped his arm, the applause that followed wasn't the polite clapping of wedding guests. It was the thunderous recognition of people who finally understood what they'd been witnessing all evening.
Emma stood motionless beside the table, her face cycling through expressions of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been shame. The perfect bride who'd orchestrated every detail of this evening had just watched her husband publicly contradict her assessment of my worth. Her wedding had become my vindication. "There's more," Marcus said, once the applause died down. He gestured to one of his groomsmen, a tall man with silver hair who'd been quiet all evening. "Commander Lane, I'd like you to meet Admiral James Harrison, retired. He specifically requested to attend tonight after learning you'd be here." Admiral Harrison stepped forward with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades commanding respect. His civilian clothes couldn't hide the authority that radiated from every gesture, every word. "Commander Lane, it's a privilege to finally meet you in person." "Admiral," I managed, still processing the revelation that a retired admiral had come to my sister's wedding specifically to meet me. "I was part of the review board for Operation Silent Guardian," Harrison said, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom. "Your mission reports made for fascinating reading, though most of the details will remain classified for decades to come." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio.
However, some aspects of your service can now be discussed publicly, thanks to recent changes in classification protocols. The room leaned in collectively as Harrison opened the portfolio and began to read from an official document. Citation for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, awarded to Lieutenant Commander Sarah Elizabeth Lane for exceptionally meritorious service as Commanding Officer USS Charlotte during extended classified operations in the Pacific Theater. His voice took on the formal cadence of military citations, each word carefully chosen and weighted with significance. During 18 months of deployment, Commander Lane demonstrated extraordinary leadership, technical expertise, and strategic judgment while operating in conditions of extreme isolation and danger. Emma moved closer, drawn despite herself, to hear details about a sister she was realizing she'd never really known. The wedding guests had formed a loose circle around our table, creating an impromptu ceremony within a ceremony. On March 15th, during a critical reconnaissance mission, USS Charlotte suffered catastrophic damage to primary reactor cooling systems while operating at maximum depth in hostile waters. With no possibility of surface support and unable to communicate with Fleet Command, Commander Lane made the decision to attempt emergency repairs using untested procedures. Torres was hanging on every word, his expression reflecting the awe of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the situation Harrison was describing had been. Reactor problems underwater. That's every submariner's worst nightmare. Working with her engineering crew, Commander Lane successfully implemented field modifications to the reactor cooling system, a procedure that senior nuclear engineers later described as impossible under normal circumstances and miraculous under combat conditions, Harrison read. Her actions prevented reactor failure and saved the lives of 147 crew members. The number hit the room like a physical force. 147 lives. Emma's face had gone completely white as she began to comprehend the scale of responsibility her sister had carried, the life and death decisions she had made while Emma was worried about case depositions and partnership tracks. But the most remarkable aspect of Commander Lane's service, Harrison continued, wasn't her technical expertise or crisis management, it was her ability to maintain crew morale and operational effectiveness during 7 months of complete communication blackout. He looked up from the document, making eye contact with me before addressing the room. Ladies and gentlemen, submarine crews are trained for 30-day deployments without contact. 90 days is considered the absolute maximum for psychological stability. Commander Lane kept her crew focused and functional for 210 days of radio silence. The implications hung in the air. 7 months, without knowing if families were safe, if the mission still mattered, if anyone remembered they existed. 7 months of making decisions in complete isolation while managing the psychological pressure on 147 people who depended on her for everything, from operational orders to basic hope. Marcus stepped forward again. Admiral, would you mind sharing what the Pentagon assessment said about Commander Lane's mission effectiveness? Harrison smiled grimly. The official evaluation concluded that Operation Silent Guardian prevented 3 separate incidents from escalating into international conflicts. Chinese naval expansion was deterred by intelligence gathered during the mission. 2 potential submarine collision incidents were avoided due to positioning data Commander Lane provided. And, most significantly, her crew's reconnaissance work led to the discovery of an underwater surveillance network that posed a direct threat to American submarine operations. He closed the portfolio with a snap that seemed to punctuate the weight of his words. In short, Commander Lane's 18-month deployment may have prevented World War III. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't shock or surprise. This was the kind of quiet that settles over people when they realize they're in the presence of someone who's shaped history in ways they'll never fully understand. Emma finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, I had no idea. All these years when you said your work was classified, I thought you were just being dramatic. Classification isn't drama, I replied gently. It's a necessity. The missions we complete successfully are the ones nobody ever hears about. Admiral Harrison nodded approvingly. The silent service, Commander. Your victories are invisible by design. He turned to address the room one final time. I've served with many outstanding officers over 40 decades in the Navy. I can count on one hand the number who possessed the combination of technical expertise, leadership ability, and moral courage that Commander Lane demonstrated during Operation Silent Guardian. He paused, letting his words sink in. Tonight, you've had the privilege of dining with one of the finest submarine commanders in American naval history. I suggest you remember this moment. Torres struggled to his feet again, managing another salute despite his missing arm. Commander Lane, he said, his voice thick with emotion, thank you for your service. And thank you for showing me what real leadership looks like. The applause that followed was different from the wedding celebration. It was recognition, respect, and for many guests, a fundamental rewriting of everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman in the navy dress who'd been sitting in the corner all evening. Emma was crying now, not tears of joy or wedding happiness, but something deeper and more complicated. She was mourning the sister she'd never bothered to know and celebrating the hero she'd discovered too late. The rest of the evening unfolded like a dream sequence, reality shifting beneath my feet as the wedding transformed into something none of us had anticipated. What began as Emma's perfect celebration had become an impromptu recognition ceremony with guests approaching throughout the night to express gratitude for service they had never known existed. Marcus handled the transition with the diplomatic skill of an officer who'd navigated complex situations before. He gracefully redirected conversations back to wedding festivities while ensuring that every military guest had the opportunity to speak with me. The result was a delicate balance between honoring Emma's day and acknowledging the truth that had emerged. But Emma herself had disappeared.
I found her an hour later in the plantation's rose garden, sitting on a wrought iron bench beneath a canopy of Spanish moss. Her wedding dress pooled around her like spilled cream, the elaborate train she'd been so proud of now trailing in the dirt. She'd been crying, not the delicate tears that photographers capture, but the raw, ugly sobbing that comes from deep shame and regret. "I ruined everything," she said without looking up as I approached. "My wedding, your moment, our relationship, everything." I sat beside her carefully, mindful of the expensive fabric and the fragile emotional state she was in. "You didn't ruin anything, Emma. You just misunderstood." "Misunderstood?" She laughed bitterly, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, in a gesture that was completely unlike the polished woman who'd commanded the ballroom hours earlier. "Sarah, I publicly humiliated you. I questioned your service, your courage, everything you've accomplished, and I did it because I was jealous." The admission hung between us in the humid Charleston air. Somewhere in the distance, the reception continued with laughter and music. But here, in the garden, we were finally having the conversation we should have had years ago. "Jealous of what?" I asked, gently. "Of the fact that you never needed anyone's approval." Emma's voice was thick with tears. "You went to the Naval Academy, earned your commission, commanded submarines, saved lives, prevented wars, and you did it all without caring what anyone thought, while I spent my entire life trying to prove I was worth something." She turned to face me, her makeup smeared and her perfectly styled hair beginning to fall apart. "Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly measure yourself against other people's expectations? To build your entire identity around achievements that look impressive from the outside?" I considered this, thinking about the years of silence between us, the growing distance that had nothing to do with geography or deployment schedules. "Emma, you're one of the most successful lawyers in Charleston. You've built an incredible career, married a man who adores you, created a life that most people would envy.
Why would you be jealous of my invisible achievements? Because they matter, she said simply. Your work saves lives and prevents wars. My work helps rich people get richer and corporations avoid consequences. Your medals represent actual heroism. My awards are for billing hours and closing deals. The vulnerability in her voice was something I'd never heard before. Emma had always been the confident one, the achiever, the daughter who brought home perfect report cards and scholarship offers. Hearing her question her own worth was devastating. Emma, your work matters too. The legal system depends on good lawyers who understand justice and fight for what's right. Do I, though? She laughed again, but there was no humor in it. Fight for what's right? Sarah, half my clients are defense contractors who charge the government 3 times what equipment is worth. I help them write contracts that maximize profit while minimizing accountability. I'm part of the problem you risk your life to solve. The complexity of this revelation settled over me slowly. Emma's jealousy wasn't just about recognition or family dynamics. It was about meaning, about being able to look in the mirror and feel proud of how you spent your life. Marcus knows, doesn't he, about my clients, about what I really do. That's why he requested your service records. He was trying to understand why I always dismissed you, and when he learned the truth, he realized I was diminishing someone whose integrity I could never match. I reached for her hand, surprising both of us with the gesture. Emma, you can change what you do. You can choose different clients, fight different battles. Your career doesn't have to define your worth any more than mine defines me. But it does define you, she protested. Everything about you reflects service and sacrifice and putting others first. Even tonight, when you gave me every reason to humiliate me back, you came out here to comfort me instead of enjoying your vindication. She was right. And I didn't know how to argue with that assessment. The submarine service had shaped me in ways that went far beyond professional training. Years of putting crew safety above personal comfort, mission success above individual recognition, had created patterns of thinking that influenced every decision I made. Maybe that's true, I admitted. But you've shaped me too, Emma. Growing up as your little sister taught me that I'd have to earn respect through actions rather than words. Your high standards pushed me to be better than I thought possible. Even your criticism tonight forced me to articulate why my service matters. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the distant sounds of her wedding reception. The music had shifted to something slower, more intimate, suggesting that the evening was winding down. Soon, guests would be leaving, and Emma would have to return to being the bride instead of the sister who'd finally admitted to a lifetime of misunderstanding. I need to apologize, publicly, to you, to Marcus, to everyone who heard what I said. That's not necessary. Yes, it is. Her voice was stronger now, more like the Emma I remembered from childhood, when she'd decided something needed to be done.
I can't take back what I said, but I can acknowledge that it was wrong. That I was wrong.
We walked back toward the ballroom together, Emma gathering her train with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent months learning to manage the elaborate dress. But her posture was different now, less performative, more genuine. The perfect bride mask had cracked, revealing something more human underneath. The reception was indeed winding down. Many guests had already left, but the core group remained. Family, close friends, and notably, all of the military personnel who'd witnessed the evening's revelations. They were clustered around the bar, engaged in animated conversation that I suspected centered on submarine warfare and classified operations. Marcus spotted us returning and immediately crossed the room, his concern for Emma evident in every step. "Are you okay?" he asked her, taking her hands in his. "I will be," she replied. "But first, I need to say something." She moved toward the remaining guests with the determination of someone who'd made a difficult decision and intended to follow through. Marcus and I followed, along with our parents and the wedding party who'd been wondering where the bride had disappeared to.
"Excuse me," Emma called out, her voice carrying the authority she developed in courtrooms. "Before this evening ends, I need to address something." The conversation stopped as attention focused on her. She looked different than she had during her earlier speech. Less polished, but more authentic. Her vulnerability making her somehow more compelling than her previous perfection. "Tonight I made a mistake," she began, her voice steady, despite the tears that had started again. "I made assumptions about my sister's service based on ignorance and, if I'm being honest, jealousy. I diminished achievements that I didn't understand and questioned courage that I could never match." Taurus had moved closer, his expression respectful but attentive. Admiral Harrison nodded approvingly, recognizing the moral courage it took to admit error publicly. Marcus stood beside his wife, his support evident but not overwhelming her moment. "Sarah has spent 22 years serving our country in ways that most of us will never fully comprehend. While I was building a legal career, she was preventing international conflicts. While I was worried about partnership tracks, she was saving lives in situations that would terrify me beyond rational thought." Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I want everyone here to know that my sister is not just a submarine officer. She's a leader whose decisions have shaped global security, whose courage has protected freedoms we take for granted, whose sacrifice has kept us safe in ways we'll never know." She turned to me, her eyes bright with tears, but also with something that looked like pride. "Sarah, I'm sorry. For tonight, for the years of dismissive comments, for never bothering to understand what you actually do. You deserve better from your family, especially from me." The applause that followed was different from anything we'd heard that night. It wasn't ceremony or recognition, it was forgiveness, acceptance, and the kind of love that survives even serious mistakes. But Emma wasn't finished. "There's something else I need to say, and this is harder." She looked around the room, making eye contact with the guests who represented her professional world. "I've spent my career helping defense contractors maximize profits at the expense of military readiness and taxpayer responsibility. While my sister risked her life serving with equipment that my clients overcharged for, I was helping them justify those costs." The admission created an uncomfortable stir among her law firm colleagues, but Emma pressed on. "That changes tomorrow. I'm resigning from Hartwell and Associates and opening a practice focused on military family advocacy and veterans' rights. If I can't serve in uniform like Sarah, I can at least serve those who do." Taurus stepped forward, his one arm extended toward Emma. "Ma'am, that's incredible. There are a lot of military families who need someone with your skills fighting for them instead of against them." Admiral Harrison nodded approvingly. "Miss Fletcher, that kind of career change takes real courage. The military community needs advocates who understand both the legal system and the cost of service." As the evening finally wound to a close, guests began saying their goodbyes with a warmth and connection that hadn't existed earlier. Emma hugged each of the military members personally, thanking them for their service and asking about their families. She exchanged contact information with Taurus, promising to help him navigate the VA system. She scheduled lunch with Admiral Harrison to learn about veteran advocacy opportunities. Marcus and I found ourselves alone on the veranda where I'd stood hours earlier, processing the humiliation of Emma's speech. Now, as Charleston's city lights twinkled across the harbor, everything felt different. "I owe you an explanation too," Marcus said. "I've known about your service record for months. I should have educated Emma instead of letting her persist in misunderstanding what you do. You couldn't violate classification protocols." "No, but I could have found ways to convey respect and importance without revealing specifics. I let you face tonight's situation alone when I could have prevented it entirely." We stood in comfortable silence, watching the harbor where other naval vessels moved through waters I'd navigated countless times. The familiar sight was comforting after an evening that had upended so many assumptions.
"What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we go back to our respective services and continue the mission," I replied.
but maybe with a better understanding of what family support means. 6 months later, I received an invitation to Emma's first major case as an independent attorney, representing a group of Navy families in a lawsuit against a contractor who'd provided defective life support equipment for submarines. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She called the night before the trial. "Sarah, I need you to know something. Every time I walk into that courtroom, I think about you and your crew 400 feet underwater with a failing reactor. I think about the fact that my former clients would have charged the Navy 3 times the fair price for the equipment that almost killed you. Emma, you don't need to carry that guilt." "It's not guilt anymore," she said. "It's motivation. I finally found a way to serve that matters, and it's because you showed me what real service looks like." The trial made national news when Emma won a $50 million settlement for the families. But what mattered more was the follow-up article that mentioned her pro bono work with veteran organizations and her advocacy for military families facing bureaucratic challenges. A year after the wedding, Marcus was promoted to major and assigned to the Pentagon. Emma moved her practice to Virginia, where she could better serve the military community. Torres, now medically retired, became her first full-time investigator, his experience with VA systems proving invaluable for her clients. And me? I received orders for a new assignment. Captain Sarah Lane, commanding officer of the USS Michigan, one of the Navy's most advanced nuclear submarines. The promotion ceremony was small, attended by my immediate family and a few close friends. Emma was there in uniform, not military, but the professional attire of someone who'd found her own way to serve. When they pinned the captain's insignia on my collar, Emma was the first to salute. It wasn't as dramatic as Marcus's gesture at the wedding, but it was more meaningful because it came from understanding rather than revelation. Later, at the small reception following the ceremony, Emma pulled me aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a silver compass, engraved with coordinates I recognized immediately. The location where USS Charlotte had suffered the reactor emergency that had tested everything I thought I knew about leadership and survival. "Those coordinates represent a moment when you saved 147 lives," Emma said. "But they also represent the moment I finally understood who my sister really is." I turned the compass over and found another engraving on the back. "For Commander Lane. She doesn't guide, she follows. But that's what makes us move." The words were familiar, echoing something I had heard long ago in a different context. But here, in Emma's handwriting, they carried a different meaning. Leadership wasn't about commanding from the front or directing from above. It was about creating space for others to find their own strength, their own courage, their own way forward. "Emma," I said, "I think you finally got it right." She smiled, the same bright expression I remembered from childhood, but tempered now with wisdom earned through honest self-examination. "I had a good teacher, even if it took me 30 years to start paying attention." As I prepared for my new command, I carried Emma's compass and the lessons of that Charleston wedding with me. The submarine service remained as demanding and dangerous as ever, but I approached it with a deeper understanding of what it meant to serve not just country, but family, community, and the ideals that make both worth protecting. The ocean depths still held their mysteries and challenges, but I was no longer navigating them alone. Above the surface, I had a sister who finally understood the weight of the depths, a brother-in-law who respected the silent service, and a family that had learned the difference between recognition and worth. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between watch changes, when the submarine moved through dark waters toward destinations I couldn't discuss with anyone outside my security clearance, I thought about that wedding night in Charleston, about the power of truth to transform relationships, about the courage it takes to admit error, and about the way real love survives even serious misunderstanding. The silent service remains silent by necessity, but the bonds forged in that Charleston ballroom spoke louder than any public recognition ever could. In the end, that was the mission that mattered most. Not just protecting freedom, but building the connections that make freedom worth protecting. My name is Captain Sarah Lane, and I finally know what it means to come home. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.